So, welcome to this RELOCAL online policy webinar, Perceptions on Spatial Injustice. My name is Petri Kahila. I'm working in the University of Eastern Finland, Karelian Institute, as a research director. Been working on this RELOCAL project now with my colleagues for 4 years. I'm going to show you now some So this online policy webinar is the first one, Perceptions of Spatial Justice, first of our series of the webinars. Shortly about the RELOCAL project. So this is a Horizon 2020 project called RELOCAL. Resituating the local in cohesion and territorial development. We started our work in 2016 and have been working now 4 years. And because of this COVID-19 situation, we got also extension for this project, and we continue working now until May 2021. Shortly about the RELOCAL project, our target is that the localities targeting to localities and their functional spaces that represent a contextual nexus where the relationship between individuals and the spatial justice unfolds. We use very closely a bottom-up approach, starting from the local, neighborhood, urban, rural, functional, urban, regional perspective. And we have had 33 case studies on this project. Today, as I already mentioned, this is the first one, and we are focusing on the perceptions of the spatial injustices in various kinds of European localities. 3 out of the 33 altogether case studies will be presented today. The cases they present and they shed light on the question of how the understanding of the perceptions of spatial injustices may provide a key for policies to solving them. The cases indeed also illustrate some potential responses revolving around aspects such as accessibility, digitalization, migration, and as well as community building. The cases and the wider topic will be commented by two EU-level representatives. Shortly about the program, we will firstly hear Judith Keller and Tunde Virak from the Center of Economic and Regional Studies, a Hungarian Academy of Sciences, presenting perception of spatial injustice. Shortly about the lessons of our all 33 case studies. Then we will have a closer look on the 3 case studies. First one is Smart Countryside, Ostwestfalen-Lippe from Germany, presented by Sabine Weck from the ILS Research Institute for Regional and Urban Development. The second one is Digital Västerbotten from Sweden, presented by Linnea Löfing from Nordregio. Third one is the Northumberland Uplands Location Action Group, NULAC leader in sparsely populated northern England, presented by Elizabeth Brooks. After these presentations, we will have 2 commentaries from the EU level. First one is the member of the European Parliament, Elsi Katainen, who is also a vice chair on agriculture and rural development and has been very active in the northern sparsely populated areas questions. Second, we have Celi Pepite, who is a special advisor from the DG Agri. She has been worked very closely on the long-term vision for the rural areas. I welcome you all, and would like to ask now our first presenter, Judith Keller and Tunde Virak. Please start with the perception of spatial injustice.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Judith Keller. I'm going to talk about the findings of our work package number 4 that was about perceptions of spatial justice, and I'll try to give a summary of the lessons from the 33 case studies of the RELOCAL project. Our research work package had 2 main research questions. The first one was, what are the perceptions of various manifestations of spatial injustice within the locality? Here we try to explore, confront, and analyze how policymakers and stakeholders at various levels of government conceive and perceive spatial and social justice. The other question we tried to tackle was to what extent does the locality have competencies and capacities to treat the causes and manifestations of spatial injustice. In our methods, we heavily relied on the 33 case studies of the RELOCAL project and the 11 national reports prepared by our partners. The analytical unit of our investigation was locality, as it was defined by the RELOCAL conceptual framework. Thus, we conceived localities not as bounded enclaves, but rather as functional units with multifarious and porous borders, interlinked with the wider socio-spatial context. Therefore, our functional units ranged from city regions to smaller functional urban areas. The comparative report that we prepared as a summary of our investigation was not a quantitative and rigid comparison, but rather one that shed light on typical and interesting patterns. We worked along 3 main analytical dimensions. The first analytical dimension focused on local problems of social inclusion within the welfare framework. Here we studied structural trends that influenced the implementation of place-based actions. Our investigation revealed 3 processes across the 33 case studies. The first one was varying dynamics of austerity-driven state withdrawal and welfare retrenchment. The second one was selective decentralization, and finally varying temporality of fiscal centralization and disciplining policies. The second analytical dimension looked at localities through perceptions of spatial injustice. Here we considered stakeholder perceptions as an integral element of the broader process of producing and conceiving space. Therefore, we analyzed how different stakeholders perceived social and spatial injustice in the given localities in relation to other localities and scales, and also how in turn they produced and reproduced socio-spatial distinctions between and within different localities. And finally, our third analytical dimension studied the way local problems were defined. And here we looked at scales of the local and scales of the problem, and we tried to identify different and common patterns in the different categories. The empirical research in the 33 case studies on perceptions of spatial and social justice indicated dualities. The dualities are conceived on different scales, and most often they are referred to as urban-rural divisions or differences between neighborhoods within the localities, or as comparisons of different regions. The main dimensions of spatial injustice identified in the 33 case studies, or across the 33 case studies, were access to public services and institutions, employment possibilities, demographic changes, spatial isolation, and stigmatization and other labeling processes. We identified challenges, challenges of spatial injustice by different scalar fields. In this respect, our investigation revealed that in deprived urban neighborhoods, the main processes or manifestations of spatial injustice were stigmatization, segregation, housing, and unemployment. In functional urban areas, employment, in-work poverty, the lack of access to services, and aging were the main manifestations of spatial injustice. And finally, in rural areas, our investigation identified aging, outmigration, depopulation, brain drain, remoteness, and the lack of lack of access to public services as central dimensions of spatial injustice. The overall findings that we summarized in our comparative report indicated the pivotal role of large-scale institutional and structural processes. That means that place-based interventions can change local perceptions of spatial injustice if they are embedded in governance schemes that are based on inclusion, participation, dialogue, and transparency. Our other finding indicated that place-based actions can overcome perceptions of spatial injustice if procedural justice is aligned with distributive justice in policies. And here, the comparative report emphasized the role of domestic policies in particular, and the role, the embeddedness, the importance of embeddedness of place-based actions in domestic policies. And finally, our last finding indicated that living in a disadvantaged place can be ambivalent and a heterogeneous experience. Therefore, spatial justice is not about equalizing measures, but rather it should be about place and equity-based procedures and distribution. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you find the following discussions fruitful. Bye-bye.
Good, thank you. That was great work when we got it running. And I think now we will go to our first case study presentation. That's the Smart Countryside, presented by Sabine Weck. But before this, I would like to add some technical info. Actually, I forgot to say in the beginning, not about the difficulties, the technical info, but just the technical info that this whole webinar will be recorded and published, of course, later on. And one thing that when you are watching this, you can have your question and Q&A session is open for written questions. So when you are watching this from the outside, you can't actually make any questions during the presentation, but please then use the Q&A space, so the chat space, and we will then bring up the questions from there. And now we will have the Smart Countryside presented by Sabine Weck, and after that it's a 15 minutes presentation. After that we have some 5 minutes for questions.
Hi everyone. My presentation is about the Smart Countryside project, an action which looked at digitalization as a tool to promote civic engagement in a rural area, Ostwestfalen-Lippe in Germany. The action was investigated by Felix Matzke, Victoria Kamouf and myself, and there is a report available at the RELOCAL website which presents you the whole case study in detail. In my presentation today, I look at our findings with a quite specific focus following the overall theme of this webinar, namely to understand perceptions of spatial injustices and how this can provide a key for developing policies. Let me situate the action and give you some details on the background. The action takes place in the region of Ostwestfalen-Lippe and more specifically in the district Lippe and the district Höxter, which you can see on the map. The region of Ostwestfalen-Lippe is, according to labor market indicators and economic indicators, quite well off. However, the two districts are among the demographically more challenged regions in the federal state of North Rhine-Westphalia. So demographic change, aging of population, the outmigration of younger population to the metropolitan centers presents quite a big challenge for the districts, as for many other rural regions in Germany and in Europe. Infrastructural deficits are felt more and more by the population, depending on locality, but public transport, access to childcare, high-speed broadband, access to health services presented quite a challenge in some of the localities. The action Smart Countryside was part of a regional action program that focused on digitalization. This regional action program mainly addressed businesses and the regional economy, but there was one digitalization project that had a community-oriented focus, the Smart Countryside project, with a focus on villages in rural areas and a focus on digital competences of the population. The project ran from 2016 to 2019, and it was co-funded by the European Regional Development Fund and the federal state of North Rhine-Westphalia. All in all, 16 villages in the two districts participated, and in our research we studied 4 out of these 16 villages. The good thing is, after the project ended in 2019, the theme is still on the agenda in both of the districts, and there are follow-up activities and new projects which take up and continue community-oriented digitalization projects. So what exactly did the project do? The way how this digitalization project was implemented was quite unusual for the German context, in a bottom-up process with a focus on procedures and engaging local population in a series of workshops and meetings in the implementation of the project. So local communities in the 16 villages discussed how digital tools could help to support village life and the activities of local associations, and what features or functions a digital village app would need in order to respond to their interests and their needs. The action also put emphasis on local capacity building. IT media centers were set up in a community center or a central place in the village to be easily accessed by villagers, and volunteers from the villages were trained as digital village experts, which then passed their knowledge to those villagers with lower digital competences. All this was aimed at supporting and boosting civic engagement in the villages, for example, bringing together those who need help with those who can offer help, spread information about events, and supporting the local associations in their activities. It is also true to say that it was a quite resource-intensive process for both, for the project managers, but also for the villagers who engaged in this process voluntarily in their free time. Let's move on to the first main topic of this presentation, understanding perceptions of spatial injustices in the rural localities. Our empirical evidence is based on 36 expert interviews and focus group discussions. And one of the questions we posed to policymakers or experts on the local level was actually which spatial justice issues they would define for their locality. We discussed spatial justice in the context of equivalence of living conditions in all regions in Germany, which is a politically highly relevant and debated theme. And the responses from local stakeholders to our question can be grouped to three arguments. Residents claim to have equal chances as in other regions in terms of access to employment, income, basic infrastructure. Social justice, as one of our respondents was saying, must not be dependent on the place of residence. Quite important is this argument is not about having the same infrastructure as in urban areas, but about having good infrastructure which allows people to stay put and which does not exclude them from having the chances people in other places have. And one has to say in general that stakeholders we asked were quite positive about living in rural areas and aware of its advantages. Second, infrastructural deficits are felt in this overall shrinking regions. To many stakeholders, it seems that in relation to other more centrally located or more urban areas, their region actually had become peripheralized over the last years. That is, quality of life, opportunity structures, infrastructure had disproportionately improved in other places, while community life and infrastructure actually had slowly parted away, had worsened in their own place or in rural areas in general. It's important to notice that this is not only about distribution, it's about a region's position compared to other regions, other places. So this is also about power relations and links to the third argument. Local stakeholders feel to be distant to the decision-making centers, both regional and central. There is a feeling of not having the ability and the possibility to influence national or regional development agendas. The feeling is that the decision-making centers are far away and thus they are not understanding the local needs. There are different sources of discontent in the region, as we have seen. Structural improvements are important, such as high-speed internet, mobility solutions, childcare and school, but also digitalization can help to reduce spatial injustice and promote quality of life. Projects like Smart Countryside manage to strengthen the digital competences of, for instance, elderly population groups and helps them access health services or online banking. Equally important are processes which manage to connect the local stakeholders with the decision makers. And this is where place-based actions can make a difference if they manage to make higher level policy decision makers aware of and responding to locally defined needs in a more direct way. If they manage to involve local stakeholders and local communities and bring them into dialogue and conversation with higher level policymakers. Of course, this is a huge task. Power imbalances do exist between national, regional and local level, or between different groups of stakeholders and the power of their voices, and one needs to be aware of these imbalances. But there are also opportunities in place-based policies and processes, and if they pay attention to quality markers of just communication processes, such as transparency of the process, inclusiveness, place-based actions can become a vehicle for understanding diverging perceptions of spatial justice, and thus a key for effective policies. As a way of concluding, place-based actions, as the Smart Countryside project shows, may raise considerable local level engagement of so far less well engaged stakeholders. Training the trainer elements in the Smart Countryside project, for instance, promoted local capacity building and had quite an impact on the digital transformation in these villages. What we see in the Smart Countryside project, if planned in an inclusive process, adapted to the local needs and giving autonomy to the people to plan and act according to their own needs, place-based actions may provide a feeling of self-efficacy and thus help to overcome local perceptions of spatial injustice. Place-based actions have a potential to strengthen learning and common understanding across different policy levels. This is quite important. There needs to be learning across levels, and place-based actions, or the lessons learned from them, need to have impact on established policy structures, on the policy routines, and how policies for specific places are negotiated and formed in multi-level governance. Place-based actions need to be supported and not contradicted by universal social policies and structural policies. In that way, place-based actions can have an impact on a locality and on structural inequalities. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, that was now for the Smart Countryside, presented by Sabine Weck from the ILS. I would propose now that, because we lost a little bit time in the beginning, we go directly to the Digital Västerbotten and we take the questions afterwards, after all the case studies. So we will save some time also for the commentary, and definitely it's required to have some time also for the discussion. So we go now directly to the Digital Västerbotten. It's presented by Linnea Löfving from Nordregio.
Hi, my name is Linnea Löfving and I am representing the Nordregio team today, and my colleagues Timothy Heleniak, Gustav Norlén and Shinan Wang. And Nordregio is a Nordic research institute located in Stockholm. And we have produced one of the 2 Swedish case studies within the RELOCAL project. So today I'm going to speak about a digital initiative in the north of Sweden and tell you how it's connected to spatial justice. But firstly, I'm going to give you some background information to the region we have studied, which is Region Västerbotten. And Region Västerbotten, it's a large area of 55,000 square kilometers, and approximately 270,000 people live there. And you can see the region marked with yellow on the map. And a large percentage of the people living in Västerbotten they live on the coast in the regional center of Umeå, which is marked with this dark blue circle within the yellow area on the map. And it's as much as 46% of the population that live in Umeå, and this is continuing to grow. So the other parts of Västerbotten, and in particular the inland municipalities, they are very sparsely populated. And the inland municipalities, you see, they're also marked with stripes on the map. And the inland municipalities are also the focus of our study. And these municipalities, of course, have a lot of local differences, but they are all struggling with a similar problem, which is that they provide sufficient public services to their citizens. These municipalities have limited economic resources. This is because of low tax revenues, because of aging population, because of out-migration, centralization of offices, and this turns into a vicious cycle when it's very difficult to attract new people to the area. In this region, it's also the distances is also problematic, even though it's also, of course, nice to have a lot of space to live on. From interviews with the regional authorities and from reading strategic documents, it's quite clear that the regional authorities are aware of these differences within the region and that they are trying to address them in different ways. And one way that they are trying to do this is through the initiative Digital Västerbotten, which is the initiative that we have studied in this project. And the aim of this project is to implement e-services in the municipalities. And this is done to improve public services to citizens. While doing this is also, the aim is also to improve cooperation between the regions, sharing of resources, increase competence. And this project is especially aimed towards municipal leaders and management, because they are the ones that actually need to make the important decisions to prioritize the digital transformation. So to sum up, this is a regional project in a sparsely populated region with large distances and big interregional differences. It's targeting municipal leaders, and it was active between 2015 and 2018, and it received 50% funding from the ERDF. And when it comes to spatial justice and the citizens' perceptions of spatial justice, we detect that the interviews make several geographical divisions based on differences or inequality that they perceive. And this is something we call spatial boundaries. So in Västerbotten and in these interviews, we detect a division between the inland and the coast, which is the inland municipality, and the coastal area, which includes the city Umeå. The north and the south, which is usually defined as Norrland, which is the north part of Sweden, and Stockholm, which is the capital. And here we also find this political dimension, since the power is located in Stockholm. Both of these boundaries also include a rural-urban dimension, which is located both on local level, on regional level, and national level. And we find that people in Västerbotten are upset about services disappearing and about centralization in general. But we also find in the interviews that many accentuates the positives of living in the rural inland, and that some people therefore think that they might have to deal with some of the consequences of living there. However, many feel that it now has gone too far. I have a quote here that symbolizes that quite well. a person says that it's a nice idea that all should have the same conditions, but I think people that live here, including me, understand that that cannot be the case. I think people have accepted that. However, when the last public offices or stores move, people fight to keep them. People get especially frustrated when they don't know how to use the only remaining solutions, the digital services. And here we also hear the mention of the digital divide. And this is something that's mentioned as an important challenge to deal with when public services are digitalized. And the digital divide or digital exclusion mostly refers to older generation, people with neocognitive dysfunctions, and also some immigrant groups that struggle to use these digital tools. I also have two other quotes that I'm going to read. I think it's both interesting and important, of course, to lift the voices of people living in this area that we studied. So this first quote is about the spatial boundaries that I mentioned. And you have to have a little bit of local knowledge for this quote. This person lives in a small village outside the village Lycksele, which is located in one of these inland municipalities. And he says that, I think it's a common problem feeling that people in bigger cities don't understand. We here in our village feel that the politicians in Lycksele don't understand our situation here. In Lycksele, they feel that the regional politicians in Umeå don't understand how it is in the rural inland. And in the regional authorities in Västerbotten, they feel that the national parliament and the people in Stockholm don't realize the situation in the north. So here we have a scale from the very, very, very local small village to the bigger village in the inland municipalities, to the largest city in the region, and to Stockholm, the capital. And this second quote is a quote from a chief administrative officer, so a leader in one of these inland municipalities that has been involved in this Digital Västerbotten initiative. And he says that the project has proceeded very well. In the beginning, we fumbled in the dark, but after a while it took form and it has generated very positive outcomes. It has given us the possibility to progress hand in hand in Västerbotten. No municipality has been left behind. We definitely had not been where we are today without the project, and I think that is the same for all municipalities. And this also is a good way into the discussion about the project. So the inland municipalities have high autonomy in form of what they are allowed to do and their responsibilities, as do all Swedish municipalities, but low capacity to act because of limited economic resources. And what can be said about this project is that it managed to spread digital competence, and through increase spatial justice in terms of more equal digital skill within the different municipal administrations. The e-services that were implemented also facilitates for citizens that can, for example, apply for building permits online or communicate with their children's schools on a digital platform without having to travel long distances. Before they might, in some cases, they even have to take half a day off to apply for a building permit, for example. And this means better access to some public services. The project also increased cooperation between municipalities and created a platform for sharing of e-services, or we can also call it resources, but for e-services. And I've written the future here, as you see, next to increased cooperation and sharing of resources. And when we had this group interview with the municipal leaders or chief administrative officers in the inland municipalities, it was clear that they all know that they have to increase their cooperation and increase their sharing of resources if they're going to survive. So this is something they are all planning to do and want to do. We also heard from the interviews that the municipal leaders feel that they have gained more local ownership and self-sufficiency when they have learned more about digitalization, and they feel that they better can lead this transformation in their own municipality. And this project is top-down, so it's implemented from the region, and it's been very little influence from the citizen in this project. So this is something that can be improved when if they continue with this, when they continue with their projects. But this, you have to remember that this project was aimed at the decision makers or at the management, so that they can sort of make the necessary decisions. And I was actually in Västerbotten again last year. This was a year after this project ended, and I saw signs in a lot of administrative buildings that said that they have now sort of started a new course for the staff of the chief administrative officers. So the people working in the municipality. So they are sort of continuing with these projects and trying to sort of continue on this digital journey, as they call it. We will go to conclusions, and we conclude that sort of understanding the perceptions and issues in the municipalities led to a project that focuses on self-sufficiency of the locality. The municipalities can decide which e-services that work and are needed locally. We also believe that digital services can increase spatial justice if they're implemented in an inclusive way and from the needs of the locality. But here we also must emphasize the digital divide and that it has to be reduced. And a question about sort of who is responsible for educating the citizens regarding digitalization is also very important, and this is certainly not solved. We can also see that digital solutions and digital infrastructure has been even more important now during this COVID-19 pandemic. And if you are left, if you don't know how to use the digital tools, you become much more isolated, and it becomes very difficult. We also have a send-up from the local and regional authorities that we talked to in Västerbotten. They all mean that what they want is more long-term funding for national and EU sources, so they can sort of skip this project after project after project. So they want to have more long-term funding. And, sorry. I think that was all I had. This is a picture from Storuman, which is located in Västerbotten. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you for Linnea. And let's go directly now to the Northumberland Uplands Local Action Group that will be presented by Elizabeth Brooks. And after that, we will have the commentary speech, at least Celi Pepite, who is here with us now.
Hello, I'm Liz Brooks at Newcastle University. I'm going to talk about a case study in the north of England. It was a leader group that ran between 2007 and 2020. So I'll just load the slides. We undertook the case study between 2017 and 2019. That's myself and my colleagues Mark Shooksmith and Ali Madanapour at Newcastle University. The location is on the border with Scotland, the east coast of England. The outline of the pink area is actually the Northumberland's Coast and Lowlands leader. The one we're interested in is the purple outline. This is the Northumberland Uplands leader, and I'll try and remember to call it that, as the transcription doesn't seem to like the word NULAG very much, so I'll try and stick to local action group or leader. Most of the people listening probably have some idea of what leader is, but a quick refresh. It's an EU program that's been going since the early 90s, It's had 5 iterations, and from the 2007 programme, it was mainstreamed into Pillar 2 of CAP. In England, it's set at the minimum percentage of CAP that it potentially can be, so that's just 5% of CAP. And over the last 2 programmes since it was mainstreamed, the decision of the central government in England has been to retain LEADER at 5% of CAP, no more, and to expand the programme. So the programme has become more modestly funded than it originally was and covers more territory. So the idea of LEADER is basically to endow a group of local people called the Local Action Group with some funds that they then take bids for and disperse on the basis of a local development strategy that they have evolved themselves based on local knowledge and consultation. So this local development strategy will come up quite a lot because it's the key really to the difference between the perception of need and of spatial justice in this area and the actual outcome of the LEADER action, particularly in phase 2 of the Northumberland Uplands Local Action Group. Now, as we can see from this slide, LEADER is low funded in England. A minimal percentage goes to paid staff. So it is mainly volunteer run. And we need to bear that in mind when we think about the impact of the changes that were imposed on LEADER in England in phase 2, which we'll come on to. So a lot of people have committed their free time, used their professional expertise and their networks to make actions happen to the benefit of their local area. And the first thing that the volunteers get together to do is put together the local development strategy, which I mentioned. And in the first phase of the local action group in Northumberland Uplands, they perceived that the most important category of need was young adults, roughly between the ages of 20 to 30. They are much less represented than you'd expect compared to the England average, and compared to the Northumberland average, they'd need to increase their numbers by 22% to equal the Northumberland County percentages of young adults. I've shown a picture here of a scheme that was actually funded in phase 2 for a younger age group, but the point here is that it created jobs for these young adults. It was actually set up by a young woman and provides some part-time jobs and so on in a relatively deprived market town at the edge of the Northumberland Uplands catchment area. So the programme based on the local development strategy for the uplands in phase 1 did a lot for young people, not just creating jobs as I've discussed, but it had training programs, it had a rich international exchange program, particularly with Sweden, but I also understand there were some connections with Italy, and it had events. So there was a music festival, there was a wood sellers kind of market, and many other rich variety of actions that you could presume would help young people to find something for them in this rural area. By phase 2, the financial crisis of 2008 had kicked in and there'd been a change of administration. The Conservative and Liberal Democrat coalition came in 2010, and there'd also been a change in governance in England. The regional level had been rescinded, so there were no longer regional development agencies, which at least theoretically and in practice in Northumberland to some extent had a rural as well as urban remit. So there was a lot of change by phase 2. And it was at this point when the local development strategy had already been drawn up by the local action group, that ministerial intervention came in and overrode the local development strategy, not just of this action group, but of all the England action groups. The ministers wanted LEADER to focus on economic goals, and they did this in 2 ways. LEADER funding was no longer eligible for revenue funded projects. So that's the international exchange, the training, the events. LEADER funding had to go to capital projects, equipment, buildings, permanent infrastructure. The other way that they embedded this was the stipulation that 70% of the LEADER grant should be committed to creating jobs. So although the local development strategy for phase 2 of this action, just like that in phase 1, had a considerable emphasis on the needs of young adults and retaining them in the rural area, this became impossible. And it wasn't just because the funding had been streamlined to focus on these economic goals. It was also in an entirely accidental and unintended way, because after the end of the rural development agencies that were the managing agencies for LEADER groups, the agency that gives out agricultural funding, farm funding, called the Rural Development Agency, took over. Sorry, the Rural Payments Agency. The Rural Payments Agency took over as the managing agency, and they had some mismatch with the local authority, which was providing the financial and legal backup for LEADER in Northumberland. And this led to over a year's delay. So we're seeing a shrinking time window in which people can apply for and spend the funding that they win. And on top of this, we had 2 general elections, and we had the EU referendum, each of which introduced purdah periods. These were periods when, by law, LEADER couldn't operate. There couldn't be any applications or considering of applications. The sum result of this was a narrow band of time and a narrow band of projects, which really made it very difficult for anyone who was less well capitalized or a new entrant to the market, like these younger people startups and so on. It made it difficult for the smaller applicant, even though the volunteers of the Northumberland Uplands Action Group made every effort to try to include those smaller applicants. And the sum result was that the LEADER principles of place-based, networked, community-led local development were largely, not entirely, but largely overridden by phase 2. That being said, it's important to point out that in common with most LEADER groups in Europe, the Northumberland Uplands Local Action Group had a somewhat limited view of disadvantage of the spatial justice issues, let's say, in its area. It didn't see a need to cater to people with mental health problems, drug and alcohol misuse, the unemployed, anyone who's not market participant, either as an applicant or even as a beneficiary. The targets that it identified were those traditionally envisaged by a charitable approach to giving out funding: older people, younger people, disabled people, and so on. So there was really nothing very radical about the local development strategy, but nevertheless it was addressing a clearly established area of local need, which by phase 2 was no longer able to address. So in conclusion, this was an action where local perceptions of need steered a local development strategy in favour of disadvantaged groups, and about a third of the projects that were funded under phase 1 ULAG, Northumberland Upland Local Action Group, were for these disadvantaged groups. The intentional and unintentional actions of the higher levels of government changed the beneficiaries in phase 2 and moved it away from addressing local need. The most able applicants were those that were already well capitalised and well established in the area, business and economic interests and elites. So a tentative conclusion would be, for these kinds of place-based local actions to be effective, the higher and the lower levels both need to be pursuing common objectives and working together in complementary ways. And when we look to the future in Northumberland, it does seem as if there are a number of very pressing challenges. The uplands farming model is unlikely to thrive post-Brexit. The mainstreaming of digital working and increasing moving away from cities caused by the pandemic is more likely to exacerbate disadvantage in this area. We hope that the replacement programme, which is called the Shared Prosperity Fund, which will come into action probably next year, will be able to address these increasingly pressing needs in our rural areas. So that's where I'm going to leave it. And thank you very much. I will look forward to any questions. Thank you.
Okay, now we have heard the 3 case studies, and unfortunately I can't see actually Elsi Katanen on the line yet. She have had some problems, but is Celi now online?
Yes, I'm online.
Oh, great! Because I thought that you are not online anymore. So because there was a cross on your. So now we will have a EU level commentary from Celi Pepita, who is a special advisor from the DG Agri, and yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I just turned off my camera to listen. I thought maybe saving bandwidth might help with some of the technological issues, but I very much enjoyed and appreciated hearing those presentations, and I would first of all like to thank and to congratulate the whole consortium for the work that you have been doing, which I think is very relevant and interesting, and you'll hear in a moment how linked it is to some of the initiatives that we're doing at the moment. It's clear that spatial justice is an important issue, and that this is something that can affect all types of area. I know you've particularly had 3 case studies presented today, but amongst your 33, some of them are in real inner city urban areas. So this isn't just something restricted to the rural hinterland. These feeling neglected, the discrimination, the feeling out of it, being left behind. This is something that can happen to any area. And if policy is going to be able to address this, then it's really important to understand the reasons for this, why people feel like this, in order to design better policy and to be able to interact in a better way. So what seems to be common and things that have been mentioned in all these 3 here are ensuring opportunities for rural residents and quality of life, and access to services. Poverty was mentioned, services like digital services, I think all 3 mentioned that, health, education, mobility, housing. But I think one of the things that is really important and emerged strongly as well is that it doesn't mean the same thing everywhere. So there's no desire or intention for homogeneity, either between urban and rural areas or between different rural areas. Rural areas are very diverse, and what works in one, what matters to one, isn't what matters elsewhere. So I think it's very important that we all take on board that disparity doesn't necessarily equal injustice. That rural people aren't expecting necessarily the same services or the same level of access as urban populations, but there is an absolute basic minimum that has to be provided. Citizens' expectations aren't the same as they would be in an urban area of just being able to walk down the road to a pharmacy or a cinema, but there is a minimum, and it's important to establish what that is and then to work out how to respect it. And accessibility is hugely important. Just because something is there or in principle available doesn't actually mean that everybody can access it. And we heard this particularly in relation, I think, to the digital world. We know there's already a digital divide in the provision of high-speed broadband and access to next generation architecture. But there's another hurdle as well. It's not just making the technology available, but it's the skills and the availability and the support so that people can access that. And something else that came out really clearly from all 3 of these, and it'll be interesting to see whether the other 30 deliver similar sorts of messages, I wouldn't be at all surprised, is governance. Governance is really key. The awareness and understanding of local needs and the perception and appreciation by the local population that they really are listened to, that they are involved, this civic engagement, this empowerment, that solutions will work if the local community is involved. And that's the only way to ensure that solutions match needs and aspirations, and that this works across all levels. And I think perhaps one point that came out clearly from the last presentation of the Northumberland Leader Group was that was functioning very well at the local level, but that it was rather disconnected, or perhaps the other levels of government were at one point disconnected, and that meant that the local level, even with all the intention and the will and the understanding, wasn't actually able to deliver on aspirations. And one concept that, when I was thinking about this, came to me as something that is perhaps relevant to this is this concept of a flat pack democracy. This trend emerging over recent years for communities to go it on their own. This deliberative democracy, citizens' assemblies, participatory budgeting, examples, for example, in Belgium, in the small German-speaking area of Belgium, there's a citizens' initiative there, and Occitanie in France has got a citizens' convention with a random group of citizens taking part, which is addressing, amongst others, the rural-urban divide. And I think where these initiatives are aiming to include a randomly selected range of citizens, then you get this inclusivity that's been mentioned as well. So the huge challenge for taking these things on board is listening. There's no way that policy can become better if that listening doesn't go on at all levels. And when it does, we see the emergence of social innovation and the value of social capital. And I think the COVID crisis, with all the awful negative things that it has brought, has actually accelerated this development in some ways of the social capital through local grassroots mobilization, lots of volunteer groups and community efforts at the local level. So the motivation behind your project seems very similar to the long-term vision for rural areas that the European Commission is currently involved in. It's one of the Commission's flagship initiatives, and it's aiming very much to identify what rural communities want, how they feel about the current situation, what their aspirations are for the future, why it is that in some rural areas, at least, there is this feeling of disconnect from the corridors of power, and what can be done about it. Probably many of you are aware of this initiative. There'll be a big conference at the end of March, and it will culminate in the publication of a communication in June next year. And it's built on three strands, really: an analysis of existing information, some foresight work looking at trends and how they're likely to affect rural areas, and then a very, very strong emphasis on public consultation, on listening, on capturing the views and opinions and input from local communities. So if I can give a brief plug, the public consultation is ongoing until the 30th of November, and we would very much encourage any contacts or your networks, if you could encourage people in rural areas to participate in that, to get their views across. That would be very valuable. The online public consultation, I mean, I can provide links in the chat later, that's perhaps helpful, isn't the only way for rural citizens to make their voices heard. We're also providing a downloadable package of material in 21 different languages, which enables rural groups, whether it's a leader group or a village group, a scout group, a church group, whoever, a sectoral group, young farmers group, or to run a 2-hour participatory workshop looking at their rural area, what their visions, dreams, hopes and aspirations are for it, and where it might be heading based on current trends and how they're likely to influence it, what the gaps are, and then what sorts of things are needed to fulfill those gaps. So I would encourage any groups that are potentially interested in that again, I can go and I can put a link in, but it's on the European Network for Rural Development's website. There's a portal on the long-term rural vision, and all the packages are available there to download. And the third element is foresight. And we've been working there with a thematic working group of a range of stakeholders, looking particularly at future developments, at what sorts of drivers and trends are influencing rural areas, and developing scenarios around two axes. And I think it's very interesting and very telling that the two axes that emerged from the first workshop with stakeholders, and which we'll now be using to develop some foresight scenarios, are democracy, sort of at one end of the spectrum, shrinking rural population, and at another end, an expanding rural population. And then the other axis is governance related, from sort of fragmented governance to networked and collaborative governance. And I think this then picks up very well to what I've heard today, and what you're obviously picking up in the project, that governance is key, sort of by local people for local people. And it's very interesting to see this commonality emerging from both the RELOCAL work and from our foresight work. So it's crucial to focus on the local, to involve people, to match expectations and harness local capacity and network existing groups together. But I wonder if that we also have to think about how to address the risks that municipalities which have less initial capacity might fall further behind unless there's a wider framework to support them. So the local is hugely important, but it doesn't function in a vacuum. And in order to enable all local groups to be empowered and to support a thriving local area, then we do need some sort of wider framework to build capacity. So this need for multi-level governance and good connections and cooperation between different levels. I was also thrown the ball of seeing if I could provide perhaps some discussion starters. So I will try to do that on the basis of what I've heard and what I've read from the studies, and also the work on the long-term rural vision. I wonder, how can better coordination and cooperation across levels of governance, from the local, regional, national to EU and back down again in both directions, how can that best be ensured? And I wonder how much of successful multi-level governance is due to the formal institutional setup, and how much is due to relationships, and how one can maximize the benefits across both of those. We've also heard quite a lot about how new technological solutions, about how overcoming the digital divide can be a cost-effective way to provide services, and that's clearly something that's very important to pursue. But I wonder also how much that improving digital access and developing digital systems, how much that can facilitate communication and involvement in governance and community empowerment. So we hear a lot about digital services. I hear it rather less about how to use digital capacity to improve governance, and that I think is something that's interesting. And then the last thing that I'd like to pick up on, really, I think, is lessons, implications from COVID, from changes. We all know that this is making us meet more online rather than in person. We're all working from home much more. What are the implications that this has for there being less need to meet in urban centres, and people being able to live and work more in rural areas? We heard comments and quotes from people who recognise the quality of life in rural areas, and if they can transplant higher paid jobs perhaps through working from home, is this a benefit? And I was then absolutely intrigued by the last comment in the Northumberland area about the risk of this migration of jobs and employment opportunities not needing to be located in cities, that this risks exacerbating disparities. And I, for one, would certainly love to hear more about that. So I think I will close here because I think it's good to have time for debate. It's brought a lot of things to the forefront, and I think there are some really interesting questions that we can discuss. So thank you very much, and I look forward to an interesting debate. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Silly, for your commentary. I think you underlined very important issues here as well, and especially the question of the institutions and what is then the strength of the regions or the localities actually act if there are no institutions in a way, governance, about the vague governance structures. But first of all, I think Liz Brooks is not online, who was actually working. But we have here Ali Madanipur and Mark Sacksmith, who could maybe respond on behalf of Liz on this question, because this is a very good one to what Silly has underlined. And we have now Mark. I see Mark to put the camera on. Is this a reference that you will give an answer to this, Silly's point?
I'm happy to do that. I believe Liz is here, but I think she may be on the link without the possibility to speak. I don't know if you are here, Liz, speak, but I think you can't. I have seen you on the Q&A.
Liz is
okay. There's some really interesting comments, Ellie, and really interesting questions. I think the ones about how vertical cooperation can be ensured and whether that's to do with institutional structures or relationships and what combination are really important. I don't know how far we've answered that in this project, but I would suggest, and I'm sure you already know this, looking at the experience in countries which have applied LEADER, for example, in different institutional structural ways. And I'm thinking particularly of the example of Finland, where it's very much been put into an established vertical structure. And I won't pretend to be as knowledgeable as those from Finland on the call. So maybe you can talk about that. But it seems to me that we have, across all European countries, the different ways in which LEADER has been implemented. We have something of a research design there, which should be trying to answer this very question. And I'm not sure that that has been taken advantage of in research. I mean, your last question, let me come to that, because you're very surprised about how this shift of people to rural places to work from home as a result of COVID might be causing disadvantage. Strangely enough, there's an article in today's Wall Street Journal on exactly this question, pointing out how in the Western Isles of Scotland, people are trying to move there and buying up all the houses at ridiculous prices, so that the local people are priced out. And this was already a problem in the Western Isles, so that businesses have had to close because their staff can't actually find accommodation. A hotel where the chef couldn't find accommodation, and so they had no chef for the summer season, and other similar examples. So it's that way in which the disadvantage is worrying in terms of the affordability of housing. And if you're in a country like England, where there's a real tendency not to allow building of new houses in rural areas, then that's a problem. It's much less of a problem if you can respond by building new houses. Can I just pick up your other point about digital exclusion as well? And this was also very important in the other case studies. I'm involved in another research project which is almost finished at the moment, where we've been looking at social exclusion in rural areas in Britain. And of course, the digitalization of services is a great advantage to some people in rural areas, people who have the digital skills, people who have the digital infrastructure, and there are many properties which don't have broadband, and people who can afford to pay for broadband. But we're also finding that there's a sizable minority of people who, even if they had the digital infrastructure and the digital skills, have literacy challenges or mental health challenges. And it's really, really difficult for them, for example, to fill in the government's online forms applying for welfare entitlements without some face-to-face contact. And so the problem is when it's digital only or digital by default. It really seems very clear to me that unless you have other possibilities as well as digital, then you are going to actually exclude people in new and different ways.
Yep. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Yeah, your reference to Finland, to Finnish, I think the leader groups, they have been acting very strongly because of the strong social capital and the institutional basis in Finland, as you know. Already from the village level, there are the village movement institutionalized, and partly also municipalities have been involved and several other local level institutions. But I'm afraid now that even in the most sparsely populated areas, the point what we are approaching at the moment is that there are no more strong enough institutions at the village level. So we are coming closer to the municipal centers, and municipal centers are now the key areas in a way. You know, one might say that the villages, they are not lost, but the emphasis should be put now more to the municipal centers. So the key question in relation to Finnish rural areas is in the future, how the municipalities will be actually more involved in the local action group level activities, not only as a financer. So far, they have been one of the main financiers among the European Union and then the national financing. But they have not been, and they still aren't actually involved in the activities, in the projects itself, only as a financiers, but not as actors. So this will be the key issue in the next programming level in the Finnish context. So that's why this Northumberland actually is it was really interesting to read, because it was done in UK in totally different kind of you know, local administration structures and the institutional structures. So it was really interesting to reflect that one also to Finnish case and Finnish circumstances. So I think in most of the sparsely populated areas, we are not talking only about shrinking regions, but we are talking about shrinking institutions. There are less institutions that are actually capable to manage a project, development projects. So in the future, there will be money available, but no institutions, no really actors who can actually manage the projects in the rural areas. This is one of the, and then if we talk about the multi-level governance issues, it doesn't help, because at the local level, the point is how to have the institutions, how to have the actors. And I think municipalities is the key issue. This is a question, an indirect question as well. How could we actually approach this more through the leader action groups? Because now they don't want to get involved too much with authorities, what the municipalities represent. but now I'm talking too much about Finnish situation. I think here is one question, or in the that the procedural justice initiatives at local level in themselves cannot lead to improved distributive justice across and within countries. For the latter, there is a need for changing the politics of state at national and EU level towards the assurance of equal territorial development that combines economic and social perspectives. Yeah, this is a very, in a way that there's a lot of things, activities, policy approaches, like the long-term vision for rural areas is happening at the EU level. And at the local level, there are the local action groups and visions and strategies. But national level is more or less like doing, I won't say doing nothing, so that I will not be too critical, but doing less anyway. So what would be then the right approach to wake up the national level as well? Not only in a way in the negotiations to get as much as financing from the EU in the rural development programs, but also act. What would be the right ways to do that? In the long-term vision of for the rural areas, Celi, what do you expect from the member states level?
Well, we're hoping very much in the initial stages to get input from very much the rural areas, but also the, for example, the national rural managing authorities. And we're also stressing that this isn't something that just affects rural areas. A long-term vision for rural areas also has big impacts and implications on the rest of the population, the majority of the population taking up a smaller amount of the area, but a bigger amount of the population concentrated in urban areas. And we see more and more and more as we think about the climate crisis, as we think about the ecological crisis, that rural areas are where the solutions to much of this come from. The ecosystem services which underpin the sustainability and survival of our planet and all its people largely come from rural areas. They're often associated with land use, but not only. And this is something that we have traditionally undervalued. You know, the clean water, the clean air, flood prevention, all these sorts of things. I mean, yes, rural areas have been seen as providers of food and as places for recreation, but often I think urban populations, including perhaps a lot of decision makers, haven't expanded the vision of what rural areas do, apart from providing food and somewhere nice to go on holiday. And this is, I mean, obviously these things are important, but rural areas do an awful lot more. And when we think now about the circular economy, we think about renewable energy, we think about mitigating extreme events like floods and droughts, and we think about forests for water management, all these things. So rural areas are crucial to all of this. And I don't think there's a single national government that can afford to neglect how those rural areas can contribute to all the targets and efforts that we have for the European Green Deal and things. But the just transition is really also hugely important. And while rural areas can be the motor and the generator for much of this, it's really important that they don't bear a disproportionate amount of the burden. If we just think about transport for a minute. Now, probably already a big amount of the population in most urban centres could live their daily lives without a car. They might be a bit inconvenienced, it might take them a bit longer to get to the shop or whatever, but it's doable. But think about many, many rural areas and how over the last 30, 40 years, rural public transport has really been cut back. And how the demographics of rural populations have also shifted. So we have a bigger proportion of older people. You have in general lower incomes, so people are not, for example, replacing their cars very often. They're not in a position to go and buy a new electric car. They're using an older diesel workhorse. So if as part of the necessary actions, and please, I'm absolutely not arguing that we don't need to do these things to address climate change, because I absolutely believe that we do, and we need to do them really, really urgently. But while we're doing these things, we have to make sure that people who have to drive 20 miles in a fairly clapped out diesel car to get to the nearest post office or to take their kids to primary school, that they're not bearing a disproportionate burden of this. So I absolutely do believe that there is a huge role for regional, for national, and for EU policy making in this. And I'm sorry if I've gone on a bit and sounded a bit impassioned there. I'm sorry.
No problem. I see from the chat there is also a question actually to Sabine Weck, but Sabine Weck is not in a position to answer, but I will. That do you see a realistic to increase the number of workable connections direct mediated through institutions between the top EU and the bottom local, as well as in European levels, in order to give better chance to place-based policies to impact higher level policies? Where or what levels of governance are the hardest limitations to be overcome? That's for the place-based policies. It's what levels of governance are the hardest limitations to be overcome? We were just talking about the national level. We have just been working on the evaluation of the Finnish rural policy, national level rural policy. And in those strategies, place-based policy is very much up to the recent strategy, and people are talking about it a lot. But then if you take the EU level rural development program in Finland, it doesn't mention with a single word place-based policy. That is really interesting. I think that the Finnish national level rural development strategy, I think Mark knows that very well, you know, Eero Uusitalo and so on, but now we have this rural council, Rural Policy Council nowadays. They are talking a lot about place-based policies. But when you go to the EU level rural development program and the dialogue what they are having, they are not talking directly in the program itself about place-based policies. So in a way, what levels of, like I take this, it's actually Katalin Kovac who's making this question that on what level of governance are the hardest limitations to be overcome? I would say from my point of view or from my experiences, it's the national level. But not only the national level, it's a national level, how it's going to be mediated then to the regional level. So basically, place-based policies, it's the regional level in Finnish case is the hardest limitations to overcome when you are talking about the place-based policies, because they are so much overwhelmed about the special strategies. Yeah, Mark, I don't see any other hands, so.
Thank you. I was keeping quiet in case anybody else did want to speak, but I mean, just very briefly, I think which level of governance is the most difficult must depend very much from one place to another. So if you're in a rural community where there is not much institutional capacity at the local level, then that really is a deficit which needs to be built. And I very much took what Sally said earlier about, you know, if you leave things only to the local level, then you get very great inequalities between the places which do have that capacity to act and those which don't. But so, you know, one thing that's required is national government building that capacity to act, helping, you know, with measures, many of which have been piloted in the leader approach. So, you know, we have good ideas on how to do this. But then, of course, your problem in Finland is the regional government level. We've abolished our regional government in England, so that's a problem as well. And I think many countries, when I hear research reports from different countries, many of them point to inadequacies at the national level in terms of recognizing rural needs and being sufficiently tuned in. I mean, I was very struck by what was said in the Swedish case study, was about the people in the nearest town didn't understand what the problem was. The people in Umeå didn't understand what the problem, never mind the people in Stockholm. And I've had that same quote in research in Scotland and in England. So it's a real issue, I think, trying to build the capacity to act at the local level, and then networking the people at the local level, both horizontally with other people who are doing the same sorts of things, who can learn from one another, and make it more of a cooperative network and less of the competitiveness of neoliberalism, and building then the vertical network so that people in place actually have some idea how to influence those above them, how to engage, how to negotiate the terms on which they are interacting. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, do we have some other? I will not talk now all the time, so Sarota is waving her hand, so please go ahead.
I was looking for the place where I can raise my hand virtually, but I realized I couldn't, so sorry for. So I would like to, I'm also from the Finnish team. I'm Sarota Németh, and I would like to go back a bit to the concrete case studies also. Of course, there's partly some of my questions have been answered in different ways in the discussion, but maybe I could ask concerning the Västerbotten case that, well, it looks like that the very local level has the autonomy and quite fair understanding what is needed, but lacking resources, financial and maybe human resources. And higher up, there is maybe not so good or complete understanding of the needs, but some more capacities to act and resources in place. So, okay, the project, the digital project, digitalization project, it has provided some sort of solutions, a combination of various things which balance this out. But if you look at, so what is that? To sum up in short, as a question for me, and also what would that mean as a message considering existing EU policies and tools, if they could be better fitted for handling such situations? Yeah, that's my question, if it's understandable. Yeah.
So, hello everyone, Linnea from the Swedish case. Well, I wasn't quite sure about the first question there. You're asking, just to sum up, sort of the what the project gave, what was the gains of the project.
Yeah, I mean, in a more generalized way, if you could sum up how this balancing out this lack of capacity, better understanding, if you just simplify the story, I mean, I know it's not that simple, and not so, this nested hierarchy of less and less understanding of the problem as you go up, but then more resources, capacities to act. So how this project can bridge this issue, but what could be kind of a more generalized message as towards making better European Union policies and existing tools. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that we need to also remember that this project is very sort of small in scale. So when we talk about sort of solving or like reducing spatial justice, this is a very small part of that. Just this access to these digital services. And what all the municipalities talked about was that, I mean, we need a lot more. So we need, like we talked about before, this is about sort of need something and sort of survive on projects, and we can survive on citizen engagement. We need to have more of a bigger structural change in both on national level on sort of how to divide resources within Sweden, but also then from EU level on sort of getting more sort of long-term funding, so you could sort of plan for, I don't know, 10 years ahead or 20 years ahead or something like that, and not have just 1 year project and then next year you have to have another project, and you can't tie them together, which was mentioned as a problem. Was that an answer to your question?
But yes, I was so interested in, like, what is that ideal level scale which could be taken on the initiative to map these different perceptions and the lack of capacities and be more like an active, in this multi-level. Now, if you just look at the vertical, because I've been thinking about the regional and the voluntary groupings of the local, like this kind of ad hoc or existing regional levels, what the role could be there in these terms. Would that make sense in this? Yeah.
In Sweden, we have the municipalities have a lot of capacity to act. They are very strong if you compare it to the regional level. So I think a lot has to be placed on to actually do things has to be placed on the municipality, but then they need support from the higher levels, such as the region. And now we also had a very large sort of restructuring of other regions in Sweden, which means that the regional development has been connected to the organization with the health organization. So it's going to be a lot of differences, I think, with how to deal with the with regional development in Sweden after this now. Yeah, but I think the municipality need to be more in charge and get help from the regional level and the national level.
Okay, I'm just looking now the question and other. Do we have more questions? I actually already emptied my pocket of questions earlier by commenting and making. Do we have any new questions? Sarota, Matti, can you see any? I don't know if I. It's actually now already.
It's 4 o'clock, so.
Yeah.
Sorry?
It's 4 o'clock, so.
It's exactly. It's 4 o'clock and 3 o'clock CET.
Yeah.
And 2 o'clock GMT. We have to remember that one as well. So I think it's time to thank you for all speakers, and also especially our special guest star in a way, Celi Pepite, for your commentary and for your very lively, participation on the discussion as well. The discussion was, I think, very good one, And although in the beginning I thought that, okay, I have to talk myself again and quite a long time, but then it starts rolling like it normally does always. But I thank you all, and also listeners who are only listeners and who were actually about partly the speakers as well. I don't know if Elsi Katainen is still online listening us because she also had an opportunity to, but maybe Elsi Katainen will have a possibility then later on during the webinar number 3 or 4 or something, because we have planned to have anyway 5 to 6 webinars in the future before the termination of the project. But I want to thank you everybody for this afternoon, and hopefully I don't say see you soon again, but well, see and hear you soon again. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.